listening to the Sermon Podcast of Brockport First Baptist. We are a progressive American Baptist congregation located about 20 minutes outside of Rochester, New York. To learn more about our church and support our ministries, please visit brockportfirstbaptist.org.
Okay, the reading today, we're going to continue with Paul's trip around the continent. It's from Acts 18, 1 through 17. It's in your Pew Bibles, page 902. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila from Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him, in protest, he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, became a believer in the Lord, together with all his household, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. One night the Lord said to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent. For I am with you, no one will lay a hand on you to harm you. For there are many in this city who are my people." He stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They said, "This man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law." Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of crime or serious villainy, I would be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I do not wish to be a judge of these matters." And he dismissed them from the tribunal. Then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. And thank you, Sally, for that reading. There were enough hard names in that. Let's hear it for Sally for that one. That was awesome. Good work. Good work. Yeah, you didn't get as bad as Julie last week. So I don't know if you guys have noticed, but we've had a string of really dark sermon titles over the last couple weeks. Last Sunday, we're looking at a story about a kid who falls out a window. That's kind of dark. And this week, we're talking about anti-Semitism. I promise I'm just going where the text leads. This is not me. You can laugh at that if you want. Okay, there you go. We're in Acts chapter 18. It is Paul's second missionary journey. And if we could put the map up on the screens, we'll see that Paul travels from Athens, where we were at a few weeks ago, to Corinth. You might have heard of the city of Corinth. It's in ancient Greece, relatively famous city. It's the city that Paul wrote the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians to, that's sent to the Christians in Corinth. Paul gets there. He connects with some of the other Jewish followers of Jesus in the city. They start preaching to the rest of the Jewish community there, who are not quite as into it. So Paul shifts his attention to the Gentiles, and the church grows. He spends about 18 months in Corinth, but then an angry mob gets together, and they drag Paul in front of the Roman governor, who could not care less about this religious dispute. In the end, Paul gets away, but then the mob ends up beating up the leader of the local synagogue. That's the story, and it's a pretty dark story. One of the ugliest parts in this story Something that should raise a little red flag for us as we're reading this as Christians here in the 21st century is the exchange between Paul and his Jewish opponents. I'm going to start reading this about midway through verse 5. Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him in protest, he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Your blood be on your own heads. This is Paul, one of the founders of Christianity, talking to his Jewish opponents in Corinth. This is the sort of thing that's really easy to just kind of breeze right over when we're reading through Acts. In fact, if you're reading this on your own, you might not even notice this little line, might not register for you, but there is a whole dark and bloody history behind those words. Your blood be on your own heads. This line, and at least a dozen others like it from the New Testament, have been used by Christians for centuries to justify the marginalization, the mistreatment, and even genocide of our Jewish neighbors. Christians over the centuries have blamed Jews for almost everything. We've blamed them for the death of Jesus, when fact check, it wasn't Jewish people who killed Jesus, it was Romans, my ancestors. But we've used this kind of language as biblical justification for scapegoating Jewish people throughout history, pinning everything on them. The Jews rejected Jesus, they killed the Messiah. Your blood be on your own heads. I've highlighted this sort of thing when it's come up before in the book of Acts. The book of Acts has a nasty habit of referring to the Jews, quote unquote, with very broad, sweeping language that's almost always negative. It usually presents, again, the Jews, quote unquote, as opponents of the gospel. I think it's really important to highlight this sort of thing and pay attention to it because we need to resensitize ourselves to this stuff. It's only been in the last 80 years or so, post-World War II really, that Christians have started to make an effort to leave anti-Semitism behind. For most of church history, fear and mistrust of Jewish people has been baked into the cake of Christianity. It's so baked in that we don't even notice it. Think about language that we use and things that are normal to say in Christian circles. Like when we talk negatively about the God of the Old Testament. Have you ever heard this sort of thing? I don't like the Old Testament God. I don't like the Jewish God. He's so violent, so angry. I prefer the New Testament, where God becomes loving. For one, that's bad theology, right? God does not change testament to testament, but it also doesn't make much sense of history. If we're honest, over the last 2,000 years, Christians have done a heck of a lot more damage with our peaceful, loving God than our Jewish neighbors have done with their angry God. And usually it's the Jewish community we're doing damage to. Think about how a lot of Christians will talk about Judaism. You'll hear this in sermons and Bible studies. Christians will talk about how Judaism is a legalistic religion. It's a works-based faith. We often say that while knowing very little about modern Judaism, which, as it turns out, is not a works-based faith. Or think about how Christians use a word like Pharisee. In a lot of Christian circles, Pharisee is used as a slur against legalistic people. Usually legalistic Christians, ironically. That cousin of yours who goes to a fundamentalist church, oh, he's such a Pharisee. Have we heard language like this? Is this familiar to some of us? I see some people nodding. We teach kids VBS songs like, I don't want to be a Pharisee because they're not very fair, you see. Here's, right, if you not, I had to sing that when I was like 7. Here's some of the history behind that, all right? Pharisees were the founders of modern Judaism. After the temple was destroyed, again, by Rome, It was the Pharisees who put the pieces of Judaism back together. They figured out what it looked like to be Jewish without a temple. So Pharisees kind of founded modern Judaism. And we do see Pharisees arguing with Jesus in the Bible. That's true. Oftentimes the Gospels will present Pharisees as sort of the antagonists, the bad guys, so to speak. But Jesus hangs out with Pharisees an awful lot. He's always worshiping with them, having deep conversations with them. He's always eating at their houses. Jesus has friends and followers who are Pharisees, people like Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, Paul. If you were a Pharisee in Bible times, there's a good chance you were someone Jesus wanted to hang out with. It's a huge offense to many of our Jewish neighbors when Christians throw around the word Pharisee like it's a slur. And it comes from centuries of anti-Semitism. All the ways that fear and distrust of our Jewish neighbors is just kind of baked into the cake. We got to talk about this stuff. We got to highlight it. We have to learn to recognize it so that we can turn from it and go another way. And that other way, believe it or not, can actually be found in this passage. If we look just a little bit deeper, we can take a line like your blood be on your own heads. We can take this completely out of context and do some terrible harm and damage with it, or we can drill down a little deeper and try to actually see what's going on in this story, the compelling picture of the early church that emerges. The early Christian community was a community of difference. It was a movement made up of people from different backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, different cultures, even different religious backgrounds. Just in this passage, if we look at this community of difference in Corinth, you've got Paul, former Pharisee, now a missionary to Gentiles. We also meet Priscilla and Aquila, a pair of Jewish refugees. And they're also followers of Jesus. This is when the Emperor Claudius expelled all Jewish people from Rome. It's a historical event. So the oppression of Jews is front and centered in this story. There's also Silas, another Jewish Christian. Timothy, who is half Jewish, half Greek. Titius Justus, a God-fearer. Do you remember God-fearers? Those are Gentiles who follow the Jewish God. You've got Crispus, an official of the local synagogue who becomes a Christian. And then there's a bunch of Corinthian Gentiles who become part of this growing church. That's all in this passage. We're just going through all those hard-to-pronounce names. Far from presenting Christians as the good guys and Jews as the bad guys, this passage actually gives witness to the radical diversity of the early church. It was a community that transcended that Jew-Gentile distinction. So of course Paul got pushback from some of the Jewish people in Corinth. This Christian movement is blurring all the lines. You want us to be in community with people who have historically oppressed us and marginalized us? Most human beings are not going to be on board with that. That sort of thing had never really been done before. Paul has some harsh words for his Jewish opponents. Most of that is hyperbole. Most of that is exaggeration. And if you want evidence for that, just keep reading the very next section. Paul shakes the dust off his clothes. He says, I'm done trying to evangelize Jewish people. I'm going to go work among the Gentiles. Your blood is on your own heads. But then in verse 18, Paul leaves Corinth. He heads to Ephesus, and guess where he goes? He goes to the local synagogue. Check this out, verse 18. This is right after our passage. After staying in Corinth for a considerable time, Paul said farewell to the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea, he had his hair cut, for he was under a vow. When they reached Ephesus, he left them there, but first he himself went into the synagogue and had a discussion with the Jews. When they asked him to stay longer, he declined, but on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. So in one passage, you've got Paul clashing with his fellow Jews. Then a few verses later, he's at another synagogue with a different group of Jewish people who are begging him to stay. You win some, you lose some, such is life, right? Through it all, the church continued to grow as this wonderful community of difference. I believe the church is at its best when we reflect the community of difference being modeled in this story, in the book of Acts. There are so many massive challenges in our world, so many heartbreaking news stories and events, even in our own community, as was highlighted in the prayer request time. School shootings, war, anti-Semitism, hostages being murdered, civilians being bombed in the Holy Land. At our church, we come from an activist tradition, right? Baptists historically have been activists. In our branch of the faith, we tend to be very big on engaging the world, engaging the culture, participating in politics and the structures of our day to try to make a change, to try to make a difference. This is why most famous Baptists from history are known more for their politics than their theology. I don't know if you've noticed this, but like Martin Luther King Jr., Jimmy Carter, Jerry Falwell, for good and for bad, Baptists tend to be known for our activism more so than our theology. We tend to engage the world and try to fix things, and there's a place for that. We need to advocate. We need to march. We need to vote. We need to participate in the structures of our world that impact so many of our neighbors. But we cannot do everything on this side of eternity. You will burn yourself out if you try. There is another approach to engaging the world that this story brings to mind for me. It's another branch of our faith that actually runs pretty close to ours historically, and that's the Anabaptist tradition. Has anyone ever heard of Anabaptists? That would be what they call your peace churches, things like Mennonites, the Amish, Quakers. Those branches of Christianity are less inclined toward activism and more focused on embodying the type of community Jesus calls us to be. The Anabaptists see it as their mission not to change the world per se, but to model within the world the way of Jesus. To live in a way that is so radically different from our neighbors, it creates this contrast with the rest of the world that our neighbors can't help but notice. It's almost like a beacon of light that demonstrates another way is possible. At the time of Paul, no one would have believed that this tiny band of misfits who are blurring all the lines, all the divisions, no one would have believed that this church could overcome the Roman Empire. Not a chance. But they did. They way outlasted it. And they didn't do it by raising an army. They didn't do it by waging a culture war. They didn't even do it by voting. They weren't allowed to. They did it through love. They conquered Rome by living in a way that was so radically different, their neighbors stopped buying into what Rome was selling. That's how you overcome an empire. When Christians embody the radical community of difference we see in the book of Acts, that's when you can start to see traces of God's kingdom showing up on earth as it is in heaven. You want to see God at work in the world? Look at a church that is overcoming division, welcoming outsiders, and building community across dividing lines. Where else but a church could an 80-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 38-year-old sit down for a meal together and discuss the deepest issues of life and faith and our time? That doesn't happen outside the church. There are no other places doing that level of intentional intergenerational work. Where else can people of different racial backgrounds, different political backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds come together around a common goal, around a common person, Jesus? Where else but this table Is everyone welcome, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of their ability? Those types of spaces just aren't that available in the world anymore. We've been so sorted by algorithms into different categories and demographics, information bubbles, interest groups, all for the sake of marketing. So much of our lives is now catered to us, our interests, our ideas, our opinions, our way of seeing the world. Technology has given us this ability where we can kind of carefully curate who we allow in and out of our lives, blocking out anyone who brings dissonance or difference. There aren't many places like the church left. If we can become that radical community of difference, if we can get to a point as a church where we actually embody the radical welcome and inclusion that I preach about every week, imagine the impact that would make. Imagine the ways we would start to see God's kingdom manifest on earth as in heaven. That's how you do battle with anti-Semitism. That's how you defeat systemic racism. That's how we overcome the forces of death and destruction that are raging in the world around us, by being a community of difference centered on Jesus. Now, you know I have to work in a plug for the ministry fair, right? If you've been here for any amount of time, you know that it's coming. A plug for the ministry fair is coming. Here's what I'll say. Stick around for the ministry fair after church. There's going to be coffee. You can chat with people. We're going to have games for the kids. There's going to be members of council around the table. A lot of fun, interactive stuff. But you are also going to see a bunch of sign-up sheets out there. And let me warn you, every single one of those sign-up sheets is a risk. You might join a small group and discover that you don't like some of the people in that group. Believe it or not, it happens. You might sign up to serve on a Sunday morning, maybe in the tech room, or the kitchen, or the welcome team, or the nursery. And you might discover that you don't like the person you're serving next to once a month. That's called discipleship, guys. That's that community of difference we're talking about. Being part of that group, serving alongside that person, learning to make space for them, show grace to them, forgive them, learning to ignore them if that's what it takes, that could be the single biggest step of discipleship you take all year. That might bring you closer to Jesus than anything else you do at this church. And if we get good at doing that in here, it is going to make a massive difference in how we live out there. The world is going to notice that. They might even be drawn to that. So be that community of difference. Take the risk. Join the Bible study. Serve on the team. Take the risk of loving those other people and help us build that radical community of grace and hospitality that we claim to be. And then let your light shine before others. Amen.